Joseph Whitehorse knelt beside his daughter's grave, his weathered hands trembling as he placed fresh sage on the headstone. The morning mist rolled across Wind River Reservation Cemetery, 18 months to the day since Ayanna had vanished into the Wyoming wilderness without a trace. A massive gray wolf emerged from the tree line, moving with unnatural purpose toward the burial site. Joe's coffee thermos slipped from his grasp, shattering against the granite marker as the enormous predator began frantically digging at his daughter's grave. Sarah's scream pierced the dawn silence from their truck, her medical training useless against the impossibility unfolding before them. The wolf's powerful jaws clamped around something metallic, something that shouldn't exist in an empty grave they'd sealed with their own hands. As the beast lifted its prize, a child's finger bone adorned with Ayanna's silver ring, Joe's heart stopped beating. The amber-eyed creature fixed its gaze on the devastated father, dropping the evidence at his feet. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "She's still alive." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Whitehorse family had once been the heart of Wind River Reservation's close-knit community. Joseph, a Cherokee craftsman whose calloused hands could coax beauty from raw wood, had moved here 30 years ago when he married Sarah Nightbird, a Lakota woman whose healing touch had saved countless lives at the Indian Health Service clinic. Their love story had become reservation legend. Two tribes united by a bond stronger than ancient rivalries. Ayanna, their only child, had inherited the best of both worlds. At 17, she possessed her father's steady courage and her mother's intuitive compassion. Forever blooming, her Cherokee name whispered of endless possibility, of a spirit too vibrant for any cage. She spoke to animals as if they understood every word, and perhaps they did. The reservation elders claimed she carried old medicine in her blood, the kind that bridged worlds most people couldn't see. 18 months ago, everything shattered like morning frost under a harsh sun. Ayanna had embarked on a solo camping trip to the sacred grounds where her grandmother's spirit was said to dance with the wind. It was a rite of passage, a communion with ancestors that couldn't be shared or supervised. She never returned. The massive federal search operation that followed revealed the uncomfortable truth about missing Native American women, how their cases received less media attention, fewer resources, and shorter investigation periods than their white counterparts. The financial cost of private investigators and extended search efforts had bled the family dry. Joseph had mortgaged their ancestral land, the same earth his great-grandfather had fought to keep during the darkest days of forced relocation. Sarah worked triple shifts at the clinic, her exhaustion evident in the deepening lines around her eyes and the tremor in her hands during routine procedures. Their marriage had become a careful dance around the crater where their daughter used to be. They spoke in practical terms about bills and search updates, avoiding the dangerous territory of hope or blame. Joseph carved wolf sculptures obsessively in his workshop, each one a prayer he couldn't voice aloud. Sarah kept Ayanna's room exactly as she'd left it, down to the half-finished beadwork project on her desk and the wildlife magazines scattered across her bed. The reservation community had rallied initially, organizing search parties and fundraising dinners. But as months stretched into seasons, the acute grief settled into chronic ache. People still asked about Ayanna, their voices heavy with sympathy, but the questions came less frequently now. Life, as it always does, had learned to flow around the absence. Only the wolves seemed to remember. Strange sightings had begun 6 months after Ayanna's disappearance. A massive gray wolf, larger than any documented in Wyoming's historical records, had been spotted near the family's property. Wildlife officials dismissed the reports as grief-fueled imagination, but the Lakota elders whispered different explanations. They spoke of spirit guides and blood debts, of connections that transcended the boundary between human and animal worlds. Now, as Joseph stared at the impossible evidence in the wolf's jaws, those whispered possibilities suddenly felt more real than the cold morning air burning his lungs. The morning Ayanna disappeared had begun like any other spring day on the reservation. Sarah remembered every detail with the cruel precision that trauma etches into memory. The way 17-year-old Ayanna had hummed while packing her camping gear, the kiss she'd planted on her mother's cheek before heading out the door, the casual "love you, Mom" that would become the last words they'd share. Ayanna had driven her beat-up Jeep to Medicine Wheel Canyon, a sacred site where Lakota ancestors had conducted vision quests for generations. She'd planned to spend 3 days alone, seeking guidance about her future. College applications waited on her desk, but her heart pulled toward veterinary school and a life dedicated to healing animals. The site held special meaning for their family. It was where Sarah's grandmother had received the dream that led her to become a medicine woman. When Ayanna failed to return by Sunday evening, Joseph's firefighter instincts kicked in immediately. He'd organized informal search parties with reservation neighbors while Sarah contacted the county sheriff. The initial response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Officials insisted on waiting 24 hours before declaring her officially missing, despite Joseph's arguments that his daughter would never stay past her planned return. The first 48 hours became a blur of helicopters, search dogs, and federal agents who treated the reservation like foreign territory. Joseph watched his community's initial hope slowly erode as searchers found nothing. No abandoned vehicle, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Ayanna's Jeep sat exactly where she'd parked it, her camping supplies still neatly arranged in the back. She had simply vanished between the vehicle and her intended campsite, a distance of less than 2 miles. The media coverage revealed uncomfortable truths about how society valued missing persons. While white teenagers from suburban Denver dominated headlines for weeks, Ayanna's story merited brief mentions buried in local news sections. Sarah watched other families receive immediate national attention and wondered bitterly if her daughter's brown skin and reservation address had somehow made her less worthy of concern. Financial reality struck hard by the 3rd month. The federal search had been called off after 6 weeks, leaving the family with impossible choices. Joseph liquidated his workshop equipment to hire private investigators. Sarah took on every available shift at the Indian Health Service clinic, often working 18-hour days that left her swaying with exhaustion. They borrowed against their life insurance, maxed out credit cards, and eventually faced the unthinkable, mortgaging the land that had been in Joseph's family for 4 generations. The emotional toll proved even more devastating than the financial strain. Joseph threw himself into obsessive research, mapping every trail, interviewing every camper who'd been in the area, following leads that invariably led nowhere. He carved wooden wolves in his spare time, his hands needing the familiar comfort of creating something beautiful from raw material. Sarah channeled her grief into hyper-vigilant caregiving, working herself to the bone while maintaining a facade of professional competence that fooled no one who really knew her. Their marriage began showing stress fractures. Conversations devolved into logistics, which investigator to hire next, which lead seemed most promising, how to manage another month of mortgage payments. They stopped touching casually, stopped sharing meals, stopped acknowledging the elephant of blame that had moved into their home. Joseph wondered if he should have forbidden the solo camping trip. Sarah questioned whether she'd missed signs of depression or risky behavior in her daughter. The reservation community initially rallied with typical Native solidarity. Neighbors organized search parties on weekends, tribal council meetings included prayers for Ayanna's safe return, and the local diner hosted fundraising dinners. But as seasons changed and hope dimmed, the acute community grief settled into chronic sympathy. People still asked about developments, but the questions came with the careful politeness reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. Wildlife officials began receiving unusual reports around the 6-month mark. A massive gray wolf, significantly larger than typical Wyoming specimens, had been spotted repeatedly near the Whitehorse property. Game wardens dismissed these sightings as stress-induced misidentification, but the descriptions remained remarkably consistent. A male wolf with distinctive amber eyes and a white patch across his chest, behaving with unusual boldness around human settlements. Lakota elders offered different interpretations during quiet conversations. They spoke of spirit animals and ancestral guidance, of debts that transcended species boundaries. Sarah's great-aunt, a traditional medicine woman, mentioned ancient stories about wolves who served as messengers between the living and the spirit world. Joseph, despite his Cherokee skepticism about Lakota mysticism, found himself hoping these stories might contain some fragment of truth. The wolf sightings intensified as winter gave way to spring. Trail cameras captured blurry images of the massive creature, always alone, always near locations significant to Ayanna. Her favorite hiking spots, the meadow where she'd photographed wildflowers, the creek where she'd once rescued injured fawns. The animal's behavior defied normal wolf patterns, suggesting either illness or something far more mysterious. Now, 18 months after that terrible March morning, the wolf had finally revealed his purpose. As Joseph stared at his daughter's ring clutched in powerful jaws, he understood that their long nightmare was about to take an unexpected turn. The massive wolf stood motionless for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, amber eyes locked on Joseph's face with an intelligence that defied natural explanation. Then, without warning, the creature turned and began walking toward the dense forest that bordered the cemetery, pausing every few steps to look back over his powerful shoulder. "He wants us to follow him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning wind rustling through the pines. Joseph's rational mind rebelled against the impossibility of the situation. Wolves didn't dig up graves. They didn't carry human remains to grieving families. They certainly didn't attempt to communicate through body language that seemed almost human in its deliberate clarity. Yet here stood a creature doing all of these things, holding what appeared to be their daughter's finger bone like some macabre offering. "This is insane," Joseph muttered, but his feet were already moving toward the tree line. "We should call Sheriff Martinez. We should call the FBI. We should follow that wolf," Sarah interrupted, her nurse's intuition overriding procedural thinking. "Look at him, Joe. Really look. When has any wild animal ever behaved like this?" The wolf led them along ancient game trails that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Joseph recognized some landmarks from his firefighting days. The lightning-struck oak where he'd once battled a wildfire, the rocky outcropping that served as a navigation point for aerial crews. But the wolf guided them deeper into wilderness than he'd ever ventured, through terrain that seemed deliberately hidden from casual discovery. Sarah struggled to keep pace, her exhaustion from months of triple shifts at the clinic evident in her labored breathing. The wolf seemed to sense her difficulty, adjusting his pace and choosing easier paths through the undergrowth. His consideration felt disturbingly human, as if he understood the fragility of his followers and adjusted accordingly. After 2 hours of hiking, they reached a clearing that shouldn't have existed on any topographical map. Hidden among towering pines stood a weathered cabin, its construction suggesting it had been built decades ago but maintained with recent care. Fresh tire tracks led to a concealed parking area, and solar panels glinted from the roof, modern additions to what appeared to be an off-grid retreat. The wolf stopped at the cabin's front door and began pawing at the wooden steps, emitting low whines that sounded almost mournful. His behavior suggested familiarity with the location, as if he'd been here many times before. "Someone's been living here," Joseph observed, noting the relatively fresh supplies stacked on the covered porch. "But who would build this far from everything?" Sarah was examining the area with her medical training's attention to detail. "Look at the security measures, motion sensors on the trees, cameras mounted under the eaves. This isn't just a cabin, it's a fortress." The door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the mountain breeze. The wolf nudged it open with his massive head and disappeared inside, his footsteps echoing on wooden floors. After a moment of hesitation, Joseph and Sarah followed. The interior was Spartanly furnished but obsessively organized, with the kind of military precision that suggested either extreme discipline or mental instability. Maps of the local area covered every wall, marked with red X's at specific locations throughout the forest. A desk in the corner held detailed journals filled with cramped handwriting and disturbing sketches. But it was the collection on the far wall that made Sarah's blood freeze. Displayed like hunting trophies were personal items belonging to young women: jewelry, photographs, locks of hair, identification cards. The items were arranged with museum-like care, each piece labeled with dates and locations. Sarah's trained eye immediately cataloged what she was seeing: the belongings of at least 7 different victims, spanning several years. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Joe, look at this." Among the displayed items, prominently featured in the center of the macabre collection, were things that had belonged to Ayanna: her silver bracelet, the hair tie she'd worn on camping trips, a photograph from her high school graduation. But these weren't the items she'd taken on her final camping trip. These were personal belongings from their home, suggesting that whoever lived here had been watching their family for much longer than anyone realized. Joseph's hands trembled as he opened one of the journals on the desk. The handwriting was small and precise, filled with observations about daily routines, family schedules, and psychological profiles of potential victims. One entry, dated 6 months before Ayanna's disappearance, made his stomach lurch. "The White Horse Girl shows promise. Isolated location, predictable patterns, strong emotional attachment to animals. Parents work demanding schedules, limited supervision. Recommend extended observation period before acquisition." The clinical language made the contents even more horrifying. This wasn't the random crime they'd imagined. It was systematic stalking and planning by someone who'd turned abduction into a methodical science. The wolf had been watching them explore, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. Now he moved to a specific floorboard and began scratching, his claws creating deep gouges in the wood. The board was loose, clearly designed to be removed. Beneath the floorboard, they discovered a metal box containing photographs, additional identification cards, and a detailed map of cave systems in the surrounding mountains. The photographs showed young women in various states of distress, all taken in what appeared to be underground locations. Some faces Joseph recognized from missing person reports that had crossed his desk during his firefighting career. But it was the final item in the box that made Sarah scream: a recent photograph of Ayanna, clearly taken within the last few months. She was thinner than when she'd disappeared, her eyes hollow with trauma, but she was unmistakably alive. The wolf looked up at them with what could only be described as urgency, then moved to the cabin door and began pawing at it frantically. His message was clear: time was running out. The journal entries revealed the twisted mind of a man who signed his name as Marcus Coldwater. Though additional documentation suggested this was an alias, the real identity belonged to David Jensen, a former park ranger whose personnel file painted a picture of progressive mental deterioration following a personal tragedy 5 years earlier. Sarah read aloud from the journal with growing horror. her voice trembling as she uncovered the methodical nature of the crimes. Listen to this entry from 2 years ago. Established primary base camp in Devil's Canyon Cave System. Natural acoustics prevent sound travel beyond 50 yards. Underground spring provides water source. Multiple exit routes surveyed and mapped. The clinical precision was nauseating. Jensen had transformed his ranger knowledge into a predator's toolkit, using his understanding of wilderness areas to create the perfect hunting ground. His expertise in search and rescue operations had taught him exactly how to make people disappear without leaving traces that would lead back to him. Joseph discovered a detailed timeline spanning 5 years, beginning with Jensen's dismissal from the Park Service following a drinking incident that had resulted in a forest fire. The fire had killed his wife and 8-year-old daughter, who had been camping in what he believed was a safe zone. The guilt and grief had slowly corrupted his mind, transforming him from protector to predator. "He blames happy families," Sarah whispered, reading through psychological profiles Jensen had written about his victims. "Look at this. Target families represent the happiness stolen from me." Each acquisition balances the cosmic scales of justice. He's not just hunting random victims, he's targeting families who remind him of what he lost. The wolf moved restlessly around the cabin, occasionally stopping at windows to peer into the forest with obvious agitation. His behavior suggested familiarity with danger, as if he'd been monitoring this location for some time and understood the risks involved. More disturbing discoveries emerged as they searched deeper. Jensen had been documenting not just his own crimes but coordinating with others. References to network protocols and shipment schedules suggested a larger operation involving multiple perpetrators across state lines. Phone numbers were listed with cryptic notes. Denver Contact specializes in runaways. Montana Pipeline moves cargo monthly. Nevada Disposal, no questions asked. The true scope became clear when Sarah found a ledger detailing financial transactions. Victims weren't just being abducted, they were being sold. The amounts varied based on age, appearance, and what Jensen coldly categorized as training potential. Ayana's entry showed a pending transaction for $50,000 scheduled for completion within 48 hours. "She's being sold," Joseph said, his voice hollow with shock. "Our daughter is merchandise to these monsters." The wolf suddenly froze, ears pricked forward toward the forest. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he positioned himself between the family and the cabin's entrance. His protective instincts were clearly activated, suggesting imminent danger. Joseph grabbed the most damning evidence from the cabin: photographs, journal entries, the financial ledger, and the map of cave systems. Sarah stuffed additional items into her medical bag, her hands shaking as she handled documentation of horrors she'd never imagined possible. The wolf led them away from the cabin through a different route, moving with urgent purpose through terrain that seemed impossibly difficult to navigate. Joseph realized the creature was taking them toward the cave systems marked on Jensen's map, following paths that would avoid main trails where they might be seen. As they hiked deeper into the wilderness, Sarah shared a disturbing realization. "Joe, I think I know who Marcus Coldwater really is. About 5 years ago, I treated a park ranger for severe burns at the clinic, David Jensen. He was drunk, belligerent, kept talking about how the fire was his fault and his family deserved better than him. The irony was devastating. Sarah had saved the life of the man who would later destroy theirs. Her medical oath to help everyone regardless of circumstance had unknowingly enabled years of suffering for other families. The burns covered 30% of his body," she continued. "He had scarring on his hands, arms, and face. If he's living off-grid, he's probably avoiding places where people might recognize his injuries." Joseph's firefighter training helped him understand the tactical situation they faced. Jensen knew these mountains better than anyone, had years to prepare defensive positions, and possessed the desperate cunning of someone with nothing left to lose. They were walking into a trap with no backup, no communication, and no weapons beyond the wolf's protective instincts. The financial pressure that had been crushing their family suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of getting Ayanna back alive. The mortgaged land, the crushing debt, the destroyed credit rating, none of it mattered if their daughter was still breathing somewhere in these mountains. But the ticking clock created unbearable pressure. Jensen's journal indicated that shipments moved on specific schedules coordinated with the broader network. If Ayanna was scheduled for transport within 48 hours, they might have less than 24 hours to find her before she disappeared forever into a system designed to make people vanish. The wolf led them to a concealed observation point overlooking a narrow canyon. Below, partially hidden by natural rock formations, were the entrances to several caves. Fresh tire tracks led to a camouflaged parking area where two vehicles sat, a pickup truck and a white van with out-of-state plates. That's the cave system from his map, Joseph realized, studying the terrain below. The primary base camp he wrote about. Sarah focused her medical training on reading signs of human habitation. Solar panels were discreetly positioned to power equipment inside the caves. A generator hummed quietly, suggesting electrical needs beyond basic lighting. Most disturbing was a ventilation system that indicated the caves had been modified for long-term human occupancy. "There are people down there," she whispered. "The generator wouldn't run constantly unless it was supporting life support systems." The wolf's behavior became increasingly agitated as they observed the canyon. He paced back and forth, occasionally letting out low whines that seemed almost conversational. His amber eyes kept shifting between the family and the cave entrances, as if he was trying to communicate something specific about timing or danger. Joseph realized they faced an impossible choice. Calling for backup would take hours, and law enforcement would need time to organize tactical teams for cave rescue operations. By the time professional help arrived, Jensen and his network could move their victims to new locations or worse. But attempting a rescue with no training, no equipment, and no understanding of the cave layout was likely suicide. Jensen had years to prepare defensive measures, and the confined spaces would favor someone familiar with the terrain. "We can't do this alone," Sarah said, reading her husband's thoughts. "We need help." "There isn't time," Joseph replied grimly. "Look at those vehicle tracks. Fresh ones from this morning. Something's happening down there right now." The wolf suddenly tensed, his hackles raising as he focused on movement in the canyon below. A figure emerged from the largest cave entrance, a tall man with visible scarring on his arms and face, matching the description of David Jensen. He moved with military precision, checking perimeter security and scanning the surrounding ridges with binoculars. Even from a distance, his behavior radiated paranoid caution. This was someone who had evaded capture for years through careful planning and constant vigilance. The isolation of his location, the multiple escape routes, the sophisticated communication equipment, everything was designed to prevent exactly the kind of rescue operation they were contemplating. Jensen disappeared back into the cave, but his brief appearance confirmed their worst fears. The network was active, preparations were underway for something significant, and time was running out faster than they had imagined. The wolf looked up at Joseph with those unnaturally intelligent amber eyes, and for a moment man and beast shared perfect understanding. They were both fathers, both protectors, both willing to sacrifice everything for those they loved. The decision made itself. Whether they lived or died in the attempt, they couldn't abandon Ayanna when she was so close. The wolf seemed to approve of their choice, settling into a crouch that suggested he was ready to lead them down into the canyon. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountainside, the unlikely rescue team prepared to descend into hell itself. The descent into Devil's Canyon required every skill Joseph had learned during 20 years of firefighting in treacherous terrain. The wolf led them down narrow game trails that seemed to exist purely for predators, paths so steep and unstable that one misstep would mean a fatal fall onto the jagged rocks below. Sarah's medical bag caught on thorny undergrowth, forcing her to abandon supplies she might need later, but the urgency in the wolf's movements made clear that stealth mattered more than preparation. As they approached the cave system, the wolf's behavior became increasingly strategic. He would advance in short bursts, pausing to listen for sounds that human ears couldn't detect, his amber eyes constantly scanning for threats. Joseph realized the creature had been conducting surveillance on this location for months, learning patterns and identifying weaknesses in Jensen's security measures. The first cave entrance was partially concealed by camouflage netting, but the wolf led them past it toward a smaller opening hidden behind fallen boulders. The air emerging from this secondary entrance carried the unmistakable scent of human habitation, cooking food, unwashed bodies, and the metallic smell that Sarah's medical training identified as blood. "There are people in there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Multiple individuals, and at least one of them is injured." Joseph felt his heart hammering against his ribs as they squeezed through the narrow opening. The wolf moved ahead with supernatural quiet, his massive paws finding purchase on rock surfaces without creating even the slightest sound. Behind them, daylight gradually faded until they were moving through absolute darkness, guided only by the wolf's confident navigation and the distant sound of human voices echoing through the cave system. The passages opened into a larger chamber, illuminated by battery-powered LED lights. What they discovered defied their worst nightmares about what Jensen had been doing in these mountains. The cave had been transformed into a sophisticated imprisonment facility with metal cages built into natural rock alcoves and a central area equipped with tables, chairs, and electronic equipment. 7 young women sat in various states of physical and psychological deterioration, their eyes reflecting the hollow emptiness that comes from prolonged trauma. Some appeared to be teenagers, others looked older, but all shared the same broken expression of people who had given up hope of rescue. They wore identical gray clothing that looked like prison uniforms, and their wrists bore the marks of restraints. Ayanna sat in the far corner, and Joseph's heart nearly stopped when he saw what 18 months of captivity had done to his daughter. She was 20 pounds thinner than when she'd disappeared, her once vibrant hair now lank and colorless, but her eyes, those expressive brown eyes that had always sparkled with curiosity about the world, were the most devastating change. They stared at nothing with the empty gaze of someone whose spirit had been systematically broken. The wolf pressed close to Joseph's side, sensing the emotional impact of seeing Ayanna in such condition. His presence provided just enough stability to prevent the overwhelming grief from paralyzing Joseph completely. Sarah's medical training kicked in automatically as she assessed the visible injuries and signs of malnutrition among all the prisoners. Several showed evidence of recent beatings, and one girl appeared to be suffering from an untreated infection that could become life-threatening without immediate medical intervention. "We need to get them out of here now," she whispered to Joseph. "Some of these girls won't survive much longer without proper medical care." The sound of approaching footsteps from deeper in the cave system sent the wolf into immediate alert mode. His hackles rose and he positioned himself between the family and the source of danger, a low growl rumbling in his chest that was barely audible but conveyed absolute menace. David Jensen emerged from a side passage, and seeing him up close made Sarah's blood freeze with recognition. The scarring from the fire 5 years earlier had healed badly, leaving his face and arms marked with twisted tissue that gave him a monstrous appearance. But it was his eyes that were truly frightening. They held the cold calculation of someone who had lost all connection to human empathy. "Well, well," Jensen said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. I was wondering when someone would be smart enough to follow the breadcrumbs I've been leaving. Though I have to admit I didn't expect you to bring a pet. The wolf's growl intensified, and Joseph could feel the barely contained violence radiating from the creature's muscled body. This was a predator recognizing another predator, and the territorial instincts were overwhelming. "Where are the others?" Joseph demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Your journal mentioned network contacts. How many more victims are there?" Jensen smiled, an expression made more disturbing by the scar tissue pulling at one corner of his mouth. "You really think I'm going to give you a guided tour of our entire operation? Mr. Whitehorse, you've walked into a situation that's much bigger than one missing daughter." The revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Ayanna or even the 7 prisoners they could see. Jensen's network had been operating for years, moving victims across state lines in a system designed to make people disappear permanently. "The beauty of the wilderness," Jensen continued, moving closer with the confidence of someone on familiar ground, "is that it swallows secrets so completely. Your daughter has been very useful to us, Mr. Whitehorse. She has a gift with animals that made her valuable for training purposes. Some clients pay premium prices for that kind of specialization." Sarah felt bile rising in her throat at the implications of Jensen's words. The clinical way he discussed their daughter's suffering revealed a mind that had moved far beyond ordinary criminality into something approaching pure evil. The wolf suddenly lunged forward without warning, his massive body colliding with Jensen and driving him backward into the cave wall. The impact echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, and the prisoners began screaming in terror and confusion. Jensen recovered faster than should have been possible, pulling a knife from his belt and slashing at the wolf's exposed flank. The blade connected, drawing blood and causing the wolf to retreat momentarily. But the creature's amber eyes never left his target. "Impressive animal," Jensen said, breathing heavily but maintaining his grip on the knife. "I can see why your daughter was so attached to him." "Yes, Mr. Whitehorse, this is the same wolf she rescued 3 years ago. He's been causing problems for my operation ever since she disappeared." The revelation sent shockwaves through Joseph's understanding of everything that had happened. The wolf hadn't just randomly discovered Ayanna's ring. He had been searching for her systematically, using intelligence and determination that defied every assumption about animal behavior. "He's been hunting me," Jensen continued, his voice taking on an edge of genuine fear. "Disrupting supply runs, frightening away potential clients, even leading search teams dangerously close to secure locations. I should have killed him months ago." The knife in Jensen's hand caught the LED lighting, and Joseph realized they were facing a man who had nothing left to lose. The network he'd built was compromised, his location was discovered, and law enforcement would eventually trace the evidence they'd found in the cabin back to this cave system. Sarah moved slowly toward the cages holding the prisoners, her medical instincts overriding her fear. "We're getting you out of here," she told them quietly. "All of you. Help is coming." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they were likely lies. No help was coming because no one knew where they were. If they were going to save these girls, including their own daughter, it would come down to whatever they could accomplish in the next few minutes. The wolf circled Jensen with predatory patience, looking for an opening while avoiding the knife's reach. Blood from his wound dripped onto the cave floor, but his movements remained fluid and controlled. Joseph realized this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Ayanna first rescued an injured wolf pup 3 years earlier. Some bonds transcend species, creating obligations that neither time nor distance can diminish. The final battle was about to begin. The wolf's attack came with the fluid precision of a predator who had been planning this moment for months. His powerful jaws clamped down on Jensen's knife hand, the sound of crushing bones echoing through the cave chamber as the weapon clattered to the stone floor. Jensen's scream of pain and rage reverberated off the walls, causing the imprisoned women to shrink back in terror. But Jensen was far from defenseless. Years of paranoid preparation had equipped him for exactly this scenario. As the wolf maintained his grip, Jensen managed to reach a concealed pistol holstered at his back, his left hand fumbling for the weapon while his right remained trapped in the creature's powerful jaws. "No!" Joseph lunged forward, his firefighter training overriding his fear as he tackled Jensen around the waist. The three combatants crashed to the cave floor in a tangle of limbs and violence, rolling dangerously close to the electronic equipment that powered the underground facility. The gunshot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the confined space. Sarah screamed, unsure in the chaos whether the bullet had found Joseph or the wolf. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood as the struggle continued with desperate intensity. Jensen had managed to fire wild, the bullet ricocheting off the cave ceiling and sending rock fragments showering down on the combatants. But the wolf's grip never loosened, and Joseph's weight prevented Jensen from getting a clear shot at either of his attackers. "The keys!" Sarah shouted, pointing to a ring of keys hanging from Jensen's belt. "I need those keys!" While the men and wolf fought for control of the weapon, Sarah crawled across the cave floor toward the struggle, her medical training helping her ignore the violence long enough to focus on the immediate need. The imprisoned women needed to be freed before Jensen could gain the upper hand, or before other members of his network arrived to investigate the gunshots. Jensen's knee connected hard with Joseph's ribs, causing him to gasp and momentarily loosen his grip. In that instant, Jensen rolled away from the wolf and brought the pistol up toward Joseph's head. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched her husband stare down the barrel of a gun held by a man with nothing left to lose. The second gunshot came from an unexpected direction. Ayana, moving with the desperate strength that comes from watching loved ones in mortal danger, had somehow managed to partially free herself from her restraints. The rock she hurled struck Jensen's gun hand just as he pulled the trigger, sending the bullet wide and causing him to drop the weapon. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice hoarse from months of captivity, but filled with recognition that pierced Joseph's heart. "Dad, I knew you'd come." The sound of his daughter's voice calling his name gave Joseph strength he didn't know he possessed. He threw himself at Jensen with renewed fury, his hands finding the man's throat as 18 months of grief and rage poured out in a torrent of violence. But Jensen was fighting for his life now, and desperation made him incredibly dangerous. He managed to break free from Joseph's grip and scrambled toward a backup weapon he had concealed near the cave entrance. His scarred face was twisted with the madness of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The wolf, despite the wound in his flank that was bleeding steadily, positioned himself between Jensen and the weapon. But the effort was taking its toll. His movements were becoming slower, less coordinated, and Sarah's medical eye recognized the signs of significant blood loss. "He's dying," she whispered to Joseph as she worked frantically to unlock the cages holding the prisoners. "The wolf is bleeding out trying to protect us." Jensen reached his backup pistol and spun around to face his attackers, but his movements were unsteady. The wolf's attack had damaged his right hand severely, making it difficult to aim accurately. Blood loss from his own wounds was beginning to affect his coordination. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," he snarled at the family. "This network spans 12 states. There are people in very high places who depend on our services. Killing me won't stop anything. It will just make them more careful." Joseph felt a chill at the implications. They weren't just facing one deranged individual, but an entire system of people who profited from human suffering. Even if they survived this confrontation, the danger would continue. But Sarah had succeeded in freeing 3 of the prisoners, including Ayanna, who collapsed into her mother's arms with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The reunion was everything Joseph had dreamed about during 18 months of searching, yet it was taking place in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. "Can you move?" Sarah asked her daughter quietly. "We need to get everyone out of here." Ayanna nodded weakly, though her legs shook with the effort of standing. Months of captivity had taken a severe physical toll, but her spirit was beginning to emerge from the shell of trauma that had protected her during the worst of her ordeal. The wolf suddenly collapsed, his strength finally failing as blood loss overwhelmed his system. His amber eyes sought out Ayanna's face one last time, and she crawled to his side despite her own weakness. "Thank you," she whispered to the creature who had never stopped searching for her. "Thank you for bringing them to me." Jensen saw his opportunity in that moment of distraction. With his functioning hand, he raised the pistol and aimed it directly at Ayanna's head. "If I can't have my family," he said, his voice hollow with madness, "then no one deserves to have theirs." The shot that followed seemed to echo forever in the confined space of the cave. But it wasn't Jensen who had pulled the trigger. Joseph's tackle had been perfectly timed, driving Jensen backward just as the gun fired. The bullet went wide, striking the cave wall harmlessly, while both men crashed into the electronic equipment that powered the facility. Sparks flew as batteries and lights shorted out, plunging portions of the cave into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Jensen's head struck the edge of a metal table with a sickening crack. He fell to the cave floor and lay still, blood pooling beneath his skull. His eyes stared sightlessly at the cave ceiling, and Sarah's medical check confirmed what was obvious to everyone present. David Jensen was dead. The wolf, using the last of his strength, had dragged himself to Ayanna's side. His breathing was labored and shallow, but his amber eyes still held that impossible intelligence as he looked up at the girl he had spent months trying to save. "He's dying," Ayanna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's dying because he saved us." Joseph knelt beside his daughter and the creature who had made their reunion possible. The wolf's sacrifice was complete. He had led them to Ayanna, protected them during the confrontation, and ensured that Jensen could never hurt anyone again. But the cost had been everything. As the wolf's breathing slowed and finally stopped, Ayanna placed her hand on his massive head and whispered words in Cherokee that her grandfather had taught her. Prayers for the spirits of those who cross over, gratitude for sacrifice, and promises that such loyalty would never be forgotten. The cave fell silent, except for the quiet sobbing of the rescued prisoners and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Their nightmare was over, but the price had been almost too high to bear. The silence that followed the wolf's death was broken by Sarah's voice, steady despite the trauma they had all endured. "We need to get these girls medical attention immediately," she said, her nurse training overriding the emotional devastation of watching their rescuer die. "Some of them are in critical condition." Joseph forced himself to focus on the practical necessities, though his heart felt shattered by the wolf's sacrifice. Using Jensen's satellite phone, he contacted Sheriff Martinez, whose disbelief quickly turned to urgent action when Joseph described what they had discovered in the cave system. Within hours, the remote canyon was flooded with law enforcement vehicles, medical helicopters, and FBI agents who had been tracking the human trafficking network for years without finding concrete leads. The evidence Jensen had so meticulously documented became the key to unraveling an operation that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of perpetrators. But as the investigation deepened over the following weeks, revelations emerged that shook the Whitehorse family to their core. The wolf that had died saving them wasn't the same animal Ayanna had rescued 3 years earlier. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist brought in to examine the wolf's remains, delivered the shocking news during a meeting at the tribal council offices. Based on the bone structure, dental patterns, and tissue analysis, this animal was approximately 3 years old, she explained gently. The wolf your daughter rescued would be 6 years old now. Joseph felt the world tilt around him as the implications became clear. Then who? What? This was the offspring, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Based on genetic analysis, this young male was the son of the wolf Ayana saved. Somehow, the knowledge of debt and gratitude was passed from mother to child. Sarah's medical mind struggled to process the impossibility. Animals don't pass along specific memories about individual humans. They don't teach their offspring to recognize particular people or feel obligated to help them. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right, Dr. Rodriguez agreed. But we've documented cases of unusual behavior in wolves who have been directly aided by humans during critical periods of their development. The maternal bond in wolves is extraordinarily strong, and if the mother had a powerful positive association with your daughter, it's theoretically possible that behavioral patterns could be transmitted. Ayana, still fragile from her ordeal but growing stronger each day, provided the missing piece of the puzzle. "I saw her," she whispered during one of her therapy sessions with her parents present. "The mother wolf. She brought her pup to the cave entrance twice during my captivity. She would stand where I could see her and howl, not the hunting calls, but the sounds wolves make when they're mourning." The revelation sent chills through everyone present. The mother wolf had known where Ayana was being held, but had been unable to rescue her alone. So she had taught her son, passing along not just the scent and memory of the human who had saved her life, but the location where that human was now imprisoned. She trained him, Joseph realized, his voice filled with awe. She trained her son to find us and lead us back to Ayana. But the revelations didn't end there. FBI agent Christina Park, who had been investigating the human trafficking network for 3 years, discovered connections that made the case even more personal for the Whitehorse family. During a follow-up interview, she presented evidence that left them speechless. "We've identified 4 other members of Jensen's network," Agent Park explained, spreading photographs across the conference table. "But there's something you need to know about how this operation targeted your family specifically." The first photograph showed a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. Dr. Robert Chen, a psychiatrist who worked with Jensen 5 years ago after the fire that killed his family. Dr. Chen tried to get Jensen committed for mental health treatment, but Jensen fled before the evaluation could be completed. The second photograph was more disturbing. Marcus Webb, a private investigator Jensen hired to conduct surveillance on potential victims. Webb had been watching your family for 8 months before Ayana's disappearance, documenting her routines, her solo camping trips, her work with injured animals. But it was the third photograph that made Sarah's blood freeze with recognition. Dr. Michael Harrison, Agent Park continued, a veterinarian who operated a clinic 40 miles from the reservation. He provided medical care for Jensen's operation and helped identify victims who had special skills with animals. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she recognized the man. "I referred Ayana to him," she whispered. "When she found that injured wolf pup 3 years ago, our tribal veterinarian was unavailable, so I drove her to Dr. Harrison's clinic. He treated the wolf and praised Ayana's natural ability with frightened animals." The devastating truth became clear. Dr. Harrison had used that interaction to identify Ayana as a potential victim, someone whose skills with animals would make her valuable to certain clients in the trafficking network. The very compassion that had led her to save an injured wolf pup had also made her a target. The network specifically sought young women with unusual talents, Agent Park explained. Some clients paid premium prices for victims who could train animals, speak multiple languages, or had other specialized skills. Ayana's gift with wildlife made her extremely valuable to them. Joseph felt rage building in his chest, a fury so intense it threatened to consume him entirely. "You're telling us that saving that wolf pup is what put our daughter on their radar?" "I'm afraid so," Agent Park confirmed. "Dr. Harrison has confessed to identifying over 30 potential victims during his years of collaboration with the network. The veterinary practice was the perfect cover. People brought their most beloved animals to him, often with their children, giving him opportunity to observe family dynamics and identify vulnerable targets. But Agent Park wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her voice becoming even more serious. "The wolf that died saving your family, we believe he had been conducting surveillance on Jensen's operation for months before he approached you at the cemetery." She produced a series of trail camera photographs showing the young wolf at various locations around the cave system, always alone, always watching. The timestamps show he was gathering intelligence, learning guard schedules, identifying entry and exit points. This wasn't just animal instinct, this was systematic reconnaissance. Dr. Rodriguez studied the photographs with amazement. The behavioral complexity here is unprecedented. This wolf was conducting what can only be described as a military-style surveillance operation. "He was planning the rescue," Ayana said quietly. "He knew where I was, but he also knew he couldn't get me out alone. So he waited until he could bring help." The implications were staggering. The wolf had demonstrated not just loyalty and courage, but strategic thinking that defied every assumption about animal intelligence. He had solved a problem that had stymied law enforcement for months, using resources and methods that no human had considered. Agent Park delivered the final revelation that changed everything they thought they understood about the case. "The trafficking network has been completely dismantled," she announced. 43 arrests across 12 states, including clients who were purchasing victims. But here's what makes this case unique. It was the wolf's behavior that broke it open. She explained how the trail camera footage of the wolf's reconnaissance had provided FBI agents with detailed intelligence about the cave system's layout, security measures, and operational patterns. The wolf had unknowingly documented evidence that human investigators couldn't have gathered without months of dangerous undercover work. "In a very real sense," Agent Park concluded, "that wolf accomplished more in 6 months of surveillance than our task force had managed in 3 years of investigation." The network's collapse led to the rescue of 47 additional victims from facilities in 8 states, some of whom had been missing for over 5 years. The financial records Jensen had so carefully maintained allowed investigators to trace money flows that exposed corrupt officials, complicit business owners, and wealthy clients who had been purchasing human beings like merchandise. Dr. Harrison's veterinary practice was revealed to be a front for identifying potential victims, while Webb's private investigation company had been conducting surveillance on hundreds of families across the Mountain West. The scope of the operation was larger than anyone had imagined, and its exposure sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. But for the Whitehorse family, the most important revelation was personal rather than legal. The young wolf had died knowing exactly what he was sacrificing and why. His mother had taught him not just to remember the human who had saved her life, but to understand that debts of gratitude transcend species boundaries and can be passed from one generation to the next. As Joseph sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, watching her slowly heal from 18 months of trauma, he understood that they had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about the relationships between humans and animals. The wolf's sacrifice hadn't been driven by instinct or training. It had been driven by inherited love and a sense of duty that spanned generations. The truth was more beautiful and more heartbreaking than anything they could have imagined. 6 months after the rescue, the Whitehorse family gathered at Wind River Reservation's community center for a ceremony that would honor both the living and the dead. Ayanna sat between her parents, still thin from her ordeal but with eyes that had begun to sparkle again with glimpses of the vibrant spirit her captivity had nearly extinguished. Her recovery had been slow and painful, marked by nightmares and panic attacks, but surrounded by family and community support, she was finding her way back to herself. The memorial service for Alpha, the name the family had given the young wolf who died saving them, drew hundreds of people from across the region. Native American families drove in from distant reservations, law enforcement officers who had worked the case attended in dress uniforms, and wildlife biologists came to pay respects to an animal whose behavior had challenged everything they thought they knew about interspecies relationships. Joseph had spent months crafting a memorial sculpture from a single piece of ancient cedar, his hands finding healing in the familiar rhythm of shaping wood into art. The carving depicted a wolf and a young woman standing side by side, their faces turned toward a sunrise that symbolized hope emerging from darkness. At the base, he had inscribed words in both Cherokee and Lakota. Love transcends all boundaries. Gratitude spans all generations. Sarah had channeled her grief into action, using the legal settlement from the trafficking case to establish the Ayanna Whitehorse Healing Center, a facility specifically designed to help Native American victims of violent crime. The center offered trauma counseling, traditional healing practices, and legal advocacy services, all provided free of charge to tribal members across the Mountain West. We learned that healing comes not just from medicine, but from being seen and valued by your community, Sarah explained to the gathering. Alpha taught us that loyalty and love can be passed from one generation to the next, and we want to make sure that legacy lives on in how we care for each other. The ceremony took an unexpected turn when Ayanna rose to speak, her voice still soft but carrying the strength that had helped her survive 18 months of captivity. "I want to tell you about the wolf pack," she said, surprising everyone, including her parents. For months, Ayanna had been reluctant to discuss details of her captivity, but her therapist had encouraged her to share memories when she felt ready. Now, standing before the assembled crowd, she seemed to find courage in the community's support. "During my time in the caves, I could sometimes hear wolves howling at night," she continued. "At first, I thought it was just the sound carrying from distant packs. But after a few months, I realized they were close, really close, and the howls weren't random. They came at specific times, almost like they were checking on me." Dr. Rodriguez, the wildlife biologist who had studied Alpha's remains, leaned forward with intense interest. This was the first time anyone had heard about ongoing wolf activity near the cave system during Ayanna's captivity. "There was one night about 6 months ago when I saw her through the cave entrance," Ayanna said, her voice growing stronger. "The mother wolf. She was massive, even bigger than her son had been. She stood at the edge of the moonlight where I could see her clearly, and she howled, not the hunting call, but the sound wolves make when they're grieving." The audience listened in absolute silence as Ayanna described how the mother wolf had returned repeatedly, always positioning herself where the captive girl could see her, always making the mournful sounds that seemed to say, "I know you're there and I haven't forgotten." "She was telling me not to give up hope," Ayanna realized aloud, tears streaming down her face. "She was promising me that help was coming, even when I couldn't believe it anymore." Joseph felt his own eyes filling with tears as he understood the full scope of what had happened. The mother wolf hadn't just trained her son to remember Ayanna, she had maintained a vigil, keeping watch over the human who had saved her life years earlier. Agent Park, who had become something of a family friend during the investigation, stood to share additional information that had emerged during the case's conclusion. The investigation into the trafficking network led to some remarkable discoveries about animal behavior, she announced. Trail cameras placed throughout the region after Alpha's death have documented unprecedented activity. She explained how wildlife officials had discovered that multiple wolf packs had been conducting what could only be described as coordinated surveillance of known criminal activity in the area. We found evidence that wolves had been monitoring drug trafficking routes, illegal hunting operations, and other criminal activities for years. It's as if they understood that certain human behaviors posed threats to their territory and their allies. The implications were staggering. The relationship between Ayanna and the wolf pack hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of interaction between wolves and humans who had shown them kindness. Dr. Rodriguez presented her final research findings to the gathering, data that would eventually revolutionize understanding of wolf intelligence and social behavior. What we discovered challenges fundamental assumptions about animal cognition, she explained. These wolves demonstrated not just individual intelligence, but cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. She described how genetic analysis had revealed that Alpha was part of a pack with an unusually stable social structure, led by the same breeding pair for over 8 years. In wolf society, such stability allows for the development of complex, learned behaviors that can be passed from parents to offspring. In this case, the knowledge of gratitude toward a specific human became part of the pack's cultural heritage. The ceremony's most emotional moment came when the tribal elder, Robert Crow Feather, performed a traditional blessing that honored the spiritual connection between the Whitehorse family and the wolf pack. "In our oldest stories," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations, "wolves and humans were brothers who chose different paths, but never forgot their kinship. What happened here reminds us that some bonds are stronger than the boundaries we think separate us." As the formal ceremony concluded, Ayanna made an announcement that surprised everyone, including her parents. "I've decided what I want to do with my life," she said, her voice clear and determined. "I'm going to study animal behavior and conservation biology. What Alpha and his mother taught us about intelligence and loyalty needs to be shared with the world." Sarah and Joseph exchanged glances, recognizing in their daughter's words the return of the passionate curiosity that had always defined her character. The girl who had once spent hours observing wildlife was becoming a young woman who would dedicate her life to understanding and protecting the animals she loved. The financial settlement from the trafficking case had resolved the family's crushing debt, allowing them to reclaim their ancestral land and rebuild their lives. But more importantly, it had provided resources for Ayanna's education and the healing center that would help other families facing similar traumas. As the gathering began to disperse, an unexpected visitor approached the family. Dr. James Whitehorse, Joseph's brother who worked as a veterinarian in Colorado, had driven 8 hours to attend the ceremony. He carried with him a small bundle that made everyone's breath catch. "I got a call from a wildlife rescue organization near Denver," he explained quietly. "They've been caring for an injured wolf pup whose mother was killed by poachers. The pup is about 6 months old, and they can't release him back to the wild because he was too young when separated from his pack." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small gray wolf with distinctive amber eyes and a white patch across his chest, markings identical to those Alpha had carried. The rescue organization asked if I knew anyone who might be qualified to provide sanctuary care for an animal that can never be fully wild, but deserves a chance at life. Ayanna's gasp was audible as she recognized the familial resemblance. This wasn't Alpha's offspring, but his nephew or cousin, a member of the same extended pack family that had shown such remarkable loyalty to their human friends. "His name is Scout," Dr. Whitehorse continued. And if you're willing to take on the responsibility, the State Wildlife Department has approved a special permit for him to live on reservation land as an educational ambassador. Joseph looked at his daughter's face, seeing hope and purpose blazing there with an intensity he hadn't witnessed since before her disappearance. Sarah nodded her agreement, understanding that caring for Scout would be part of Ayanna's healing process. "We'll take him," Ayanna said without hesitation. "Alpha's family will always have a home with us." As the sun set over the Wind River Mountains, the Whitehorse family walked home together with Scout sleeping peacefully in Ayanna's arms. The young wolf would grow up knowing kindness instead of fear, love instead of abandonment, and perhaps he would someday understand the legacy of gratitude and loyalty that connected his family to theirs. The circle of debt and devotion that had begun 3 years earlier when a teenage girl rescued an injured wolf pup would continue into the next generation, proving that some bonds transcend species, time, and even death itself. Behind them, the memorial sculpture stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, a permanent reminder that love, loyalty, and sacrifice create connections that nothing can break. Sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as the deepest heartbreak. When Joseph and Sarah Whitehorse watched that magnificent wolf sacrifice his life to save their daughter, they discovered a truth that every parent over 50 knows in their bones, that love doesn't end when we lose someone precious. It transforms, it transcends, and sometimes it returns to us in ways we never imagined possible. Alpha's mother had taught her son that gratitude is a sacred debt, passed from one generation to the next like a family heirloom made of pure devotion. How many of us have felt that same fierce protectiveness for our children, that willingness to give everything for their safety and happiness? The Whitehorse family learned that healing doesn't erase the scars. It teaches us that our wounds can become doorways to deeper compassion. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest hours, when hope feels like a luxury we can't afford, love finds a way to circle back and surprise us. The Wolfpack didn't forget the kindness shown to them years earlier, just as our own acts of love create ripples that touch lives we may never know about. Sometimes our greatest losses prepare us for our most unexpected blessings. What acts of kindness from your past do you think might still be creating ripples of goodness in the world? Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that felt like a loved one was still watching over you? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.